I became interested in poetry in my last 2 years of high school, so Form 5 and Form 6. And there were some teachers there at the school who were young, enthusiastic, intelligent, and great role models. And they introduced me to the poetry of T.S. Eliot in particular, and to the songs of the Weavers, who were a folk group in America with Pete Seeger as one of the members, and to the words and songs of Bob Dylan. And so those 2 years for me were such a steep learning curve. It was just extraordinary. One teacher in particular, Miss Vines, took an interest in me, and she was the first teacher to ever say to me, "You are intelligent, you can go to university." And so she planted a seed in my brain in Form 5 that I could go to university. And that was a revelation, because up until then I'd been a poor student, only interested in playing sport, and I hadn't done well academically. So I looked at the poetry of T.S. Eliot, not that I understood it, I had no idea what he was writing about, but something in that poetry spoke to me, and something in it attracted my attention, and also implanted in me the thought that I'd like to be a poet. I wanted to be a poet without ever having written a poem. And not that I was a good student, because I was unraveling at that time as well, but I started writing poetry in lectures. Instead of taking lecture notes, I'd be writing poems. When I eventually went crazy in 1976, after I graduated from uni, couldn't get a job because I was, by this stage, unraveling. After I went crazy, got out of hospital after 4 months in hospital, in 2 different hospitals, I started documenting my madness in poetry. And that was the real beginning of my poetic life. I started systematically documenting my madness in poetry. So I kept writing poems and kept writing poems. So those little bits of poems and those little bits of paper gave me hope that there was something else to happen in my life. I kept writing and kept writing. And then eventually in 1993, when I was 40, so life begins when you're 40, Susan Hawthorne at Spinifex Press, who I'd gone to uni with, so it's not what you know, it's who you know, said, "I'd like to publish your poems in a book." And so Poems from the Madhouse was born. And almost overnight, from the day of the launch to the next day, almost overnight, my life changed from being just someone with schizophrenia, someone who was just a psych patient, to being Sandy Jeff's poet. And that was a revelation.
Yep.
And this is my first book ever published. And Here I Sit is the first poem in my first book. And it's the first poem I ever wrote about being crazy. And I remember it well. I was sitting on a bed in the Queen Victoria Hospital psych ward in November, it was about November the 17th or 19th, something like that, 1976. And I was waiting to go into a morning meeting session I used to have every morning. And as I was sitting on my bed waiting to do that, I wrote this poem. So it's called Here I Sit. Here, surrounded by the swirling nothingness of chaos, with the indignant idiocy of haze and alienation, I sit, where perception becomes a burden, and where the burden becomes a loss of perception. What is this world? This world of contradictions, this tortuous maze of distress, where confusion reigns and clarity remains submerged. Here, surrounded by the sterile relics of sanity, lost in a labyrinth of refracted thought, I sit, where life becomes a burden, where the burden becomes the loss of life. What is this confusion of the spheres, this unyielding perplexity that determinedly withers my countenance and renders me helpless? So it was a poem, a poem about confusion, really, but even though it was about confusion, it came out so clear and so formed. It was amazing how that happened. And yeah, the first poem I ever wrote about being crazy. And that's why it's so important to me, because it was the beginning of a whole series of poems about my mental illness. But the other thing I did through COVID was I started a haiku diary. So I started documenting a daily diary in haiku poetry. And I started the diary with a 2.2 lockdown on about July the 9th, I think it was. And I kept it up until November the 1st or 2nd when Dan let us out of our lockdown. So it's about 125 days of this diary in haiku poetry. And for me, that became my focus, my daily focus. I say this often, my aim in poetry is to make a stern God laugh and move angels to tears. That's what I want to do with my poetry.